Hello, I'm now going to check. Yes, my microphone appears to be on, so people should be able to hear me. Welcome on this extremely wet and rather cool Pittsburgh day, at the end of a rather wet and cool Pittsburgh week. Lovely to see you all. Happy soon-to-be Halloween to all of you. Everybody's wishing everybody happy Halloween. So hello, Joan and Martha and John Henry. Hi, John Henry. Mark, Mary Lou. Welcome back. Karen. Boo to you, James, too. Nice to see all the regulars tuning in. We had a very good attendance last week with the first of these two programs, so let's hope we get a nice turnout today as well. Because what else would you do if you're in Pittsburgh on a wet, miserable day like this? It's not a day for sitting in the yard. In case you're wondering, if you can hear the music in the background, I'm going to turn it up just a teeny bit. It's my favorite miserable composer. I actually adore him. It's Mahler, but it's not one of his symphonic works. It's from his Kindertotenlieder, which is very suitable for this particular program because that translates as songs on the death of children, which is about as cheerful as you should get when talking about Gothic horror. Hello, Helen. Another regular. Yes, indeed you are. Deeply loyal, and we love you for it. Hello, Betty. And Schwickley. Mahler is one of my particular favorite composers. I only wish he'd written opera because the scale of his symphonic work, and especially the choral pieces, is just extraordinary. Dark and gloomy Mashpee in Massachusetts on Cape Cod. Well, if you're on Cape Cod, I don't care that it's dark and gloomy. You're on Cape Cod, for goodness sake. One of the more delightful places to be. Hello, Lynn. Yes, I am right. Yes, yes, indeedy. Although, you know, if you're going to be wet and miserable somewhere, you cannot beat Western Pennsylvania because at least it's wet and miserable and covered in trees, which are looking glorious this year. The fall this year is absolutely beautiful. It's wet. I think it's the fact we had such a dry period, followed by this current rain, but the colors this year are extraordinary. I don't know what it's like elsewhere, possibly in New England, but beautiful here. And I see from friends on Facebook that back in Ireland, the colors are rather beautiful too, which is not always the case. It very often just goes from green to dirty brown, but this year the colors look absolutely wonderful. It's definitely climate change. I suppose there's an upside to everything. Sarah, thank you. Happy Samhain to you too, and I'm glad you love the radio play, and I'll be talking about that in a moment, and upcoming delights. But yes, I'm glad you enjoyed it. We've had a wonderful response to it, and for those who haven't listened to it yet, it finishes on Halloween, so you've only got, 3 days. So get listening. Well, I'm glad you're peering at us, Dennis. Less than 3 days, you're quite right. Less than 3 days. It goes so quickly. Have you ever known a year to go so miserably and so quickly at the same time? It's quite extraordinary. I can't believe that it's Halloween. It's very indicative of the fact that you find things that you judge this year by. Like the last time I wore a suit was February for the opening night of Midsummer Night's Dream. And I normally manage to get a suit on at least 5 or 6 times a year, so it's a really bad time. I'm known for my sartorial elegance, and this year has driven it underground. It's quite dreadful. Yes, there's the thing now. Even if you purchase on Halloween, you can still have a 72-hour validity for it. So, but I recommend you purchase it now so that you can listen to it more than once before Halloween. You see, the moment I say the word, the ad comes up. We are so efficient at PICT Classic Theatre. We get that information out to you immediately. We don't hang about. Turning that one up because it's rather lovely. Ah, Mahler. Very sad case, very sad man. But beautiful music. And for anybody who's interested, that's Dame Janet Baker singing, one of the finest contralto's voices ever. Hello, Christine. Hello, Kathy in Ohio. We're beginning to reach out. We keep sending out, and we'll be sending out another sort of questionnaire thing, survey soon, concerning, A, when is the best time for us to do these webinars? B, are there any particular topics you want? C, if you've looked back at old webinars and find questions you forgot to ask or would now like to ask, send us an email. We will always get back to you. We always respond. Hello, Jean in Rochester and Grace in Dublin. And yes, we're all doing fine. We're all in rude good health here. And I hope you are well too and improving, because I know you were not well, but I'm delighted that you're still with us. And Magda in San Antonio, well, hey. And Deborah in Pittsburgh. How far apart can you possibly be? And yet you're here with me today in the delights of my living room. And it's wonderful to have you here in front of about 1/5 of my book collection. God, I've got to get rid of some of these books. What was I talking about? Mahler, yes. Wonderful composer. Beautiful. His music is so gloriously theatrical as well. Rather like Beethoven. Oh, we're all beginning to line up here. Very nice. Barbara, hello. It's always nice when you say hi. I know not everybody does, but it is always nice. And we will say to everybody who does join us each week, whether you say hi on chat or not, hello, Marlene. I think people are, yes, you're right. Everybody's celebrating Halloween like there's no tomorrow, because there may not be. But it's fun. It's great. I never actually got the Halloween thing particularly, although in Ireland it's Samhain. It's the late autumn festival. But I never quite got it myself. But because my favorite holiday comes after that. My favorite holiday of the year is the one and only Thanksgiving. I think it's one of the best ideas ever come up with, and I love Thanksgiving. Much prefer it to all the others. Another Latrobe viewer, Bev, hello, and hi, Kel. And We're going to start pretty soon now. But what I was going to say was, for those of you who are with us, for those of you who say hi on the chat, for those of you who don't, for those of you who tune in later on and check us out on the website because you can't make the webinar, please spread the word. If you enjoy the webinars, and we do our best to be entertaining as well as informative, please tell your friends. Ask them to try us out as well, because you never know, they might enjoy it too. And the worst kept secrets are the best kept secrets. So let's not have secrets from one another. Let's tell everybody that PICT Classic Theatre Education does these every week. And we will, except for Christmas and possibly New Year. Anyway, the time has come for me to turn down the music and to make a start on this. Now, we are following up our second program, which was under the generic title Gothic Horror. But as you, for those of you who were with me last week, realized it's not just about Gothic horror, it's about the whole principle of horror and what makes horror so attractive. And so attractive to literature. Novelists have been writing about it for a very long time. Theatre has been dealing with it for a very long time. Movies and television deal with it. Why is it always so attractive? And people always say that there are, oh, science fiction is dead in the cinema, but it comes back. Horror is dead in the cinema, but it comes back. And even in the theatre, it comes back. And novelists can't resist writing about it. And if that weren't true, Stephen King would be a pauper. But no, he's a very rich man, because he knows that we delight in one particular thing: fear. We love it. As when Luke Skywalker said, "I'm not afraid," Yoda's response was one of the truest lines ever spoken in movies. You will be. You will be. I checked my trusty Oxford English Dictionary for the definition of the word fear, and there were several definitions. An unpleasant emotion caused by the threat of danger, pain, or harm. Danger, pain, or harm. I remembered that simple aphorism, the burnt child fears the fire. When we know it hurts us, we are afraid of it. When we know it's a danger to us, we are afraid of it. When we know it's going to put us in danger, we are afraid of it. So why are we so damned attracted to it? Second definition, the feeling of anxiety concerning the outcome of something or the safety of someone. We are afraid of the outcome of something. One might say November the 3rd, but I'm not going to go there. But we are always afraid that something, the outcome, the thing that's going to happen will not bode well for us, or that the thing that somebody is going to do will not end happily. Fear. Another one, the likelihood of something unwelcome happening. Which is the surprise, not that which we anticipate, but that something unwelcome will just happen. It will just all go wrong. And we are in a perpetual state of anticipation. It's a form of fear. And the final one, a mixed feeling of dread and reverence. And that's an interesting definition, because we do revere very often that which we fear. And if you don't believe me, God comes into that category. We both fear and reverence God, if that is your particular bag. And the word fear comes into that as well, because God, in whatever form you choose to believe in God, in whatever form that is, it, he, her, whatever, is something to be feared as well as revered. And that can have a negative as well as a positive implication in our psyche, in the way we see and imagine things. So there you got four simple definitions of this word fear, which is something we should run from, and yet which strangely attracts us, which we find strangely compulsive, strangely enthralling. All of these, by the way, are what one might describe as rational fears, except perhaps the last one, but that depends on your belief. But what about irrational fear? Why does irrational horror terrify us? Why is it that things which we know not to be true, we are willing to accept as truth? It is part of that wonderful theatrical principle that makes theatre work, the willing suspension of disbelief. Things that you know aren't there, you are willing to believe in order to allow yourself to be frightened. Now, my argument would be that those things that we don't believe in, we did once. That it is a kind of an ancestral inheritance, that we have developed a belief in, or we did develop a belief that when we could not explain something, when something it appeared irrational, we rationalized it in the only way we could. Hence mythology, hence that's that line of ancestral fear that goes back and comes to us now in aphorisms and simple sayings that we've learned to accept as a kind of truth. It's not real, but it's a kind of truth that we can be excited about. And I mean excited in that sense. It makes us feel excited. It gives us that something to be afraid of, something to just worry us, something out of the corner of the eye. So it's the same, this irrational fear, I think it's the same kind of, it's a fascination. We become fascinated by the ideas of things. And it is based on the fact that it is slightly at one step removed from us. It's the same, I mentioned this last week, it's the same fascination that we feel when we observe, you see a road accident, you see a car crash or something, you stop and look. The ambulance fascination, you can call it. It's not happening to us. It's happening, but it's not happening to us. We are conscious of its danger, but it's not danger to us. We are conscious of its terror or its horror or its awfulness, but it's not happening to us. And that allows us at one step of a remove to observe it, to be fascinated by it. So why do we delight in fear? Because we do. If we didn't delight in fear, then horror stories would not be possible. Horror stories, we would be indifferent to them. We would not see the point. But we are attracted to them. We are delighted by them. Why do we delight in our own fear? The feeling that the blood is pumping through the veins. For the same reason, people go, for some unknown reason, people go hang gliding or parachute jumping or climbing up sheer rock faces, bare hands and things. Why? Because it pumps the heart, it gets the adrenaline flowing. We are using that fear, in a sense, to demonstrate to ourselves that we are alive, that we are real. We face danger because it frightens us. It's not simply out of courage, it's almost daring ourselves to face the unknown, to face the danger. Daring ourselves to go down into the dark cellar, up into the dark attic. Daring ourselves, and in terms of horror stories, vicariously, at one step remove. We will travel with the hero stroke heroine up the staircase or down into the cellar. We will excite ourselves with the possibility of their danger, of something unpleasant happening to them that we can watch one step removed. We're experiencing our fear secondhand, as it were. Those noises in the dark, why do they frighten us? What we cannot explain or comprehend becomes our irrational fear. And upon that principle, all Gothic style horror is based, providing you enough information that you can suspect what might be going on. You can dread what might be going on. You can be excited by what might be going on, but you are one step removed from it. And as again I said last week, even hell is Gothic horror, because our concept of hell, most of our concepts of hell, are based on Dante's Divine Comedy. If you look at it, the 7 stages of hell, the 7 deadly sins, going down and down and down until eventually you meet Satan at the very bottom. And what is Satan doing but constantly devouring and redevouring Judas, the ultimate sinner? All of those images of hell are now built into our psyche. They've been used by teachers and priests and whatever for generations now to make us afraid of the consequences of our evil doings. And they excite us. Whether you are fervently religious or fervently atheistic makes no difference. The idea of the horrors excite you. You can't escape it. The dark itself frightens us. I remember when I was very young, which was, to be quite honest, 1 or 2 years ago now, but when I was very young, I remember seeing on television, I cannot remember what the program was, and it could have been something like Lassie or something like that, but there was a line, and for some reason, it's, you know, the way things you hear in childhood suddenly stick in the brain for reasons you cannot understand, but this line stuck in my brain. There is nothing there in the dark that wasn't there when the light was on. And it's meant to reassure us. It meant to comfort us, to say, there's nothing to be afraid of. There is nothing there in the dark that wasn't there when the light was on. Or is there? It's an irrational fear of the dark. We are afraid of the dark. We can't help ourselves. And I don't care who you are, how brave you are, what you do for a living, whatever else. There is something about the absence of light that induces fear in us, the unexpected, the unknown, the surprising thing happening will tend to exaggerate itself in the dark. It's one of the things that horror stories use endlessly. We use it in the theater all the time. It's a primal fear. It goes back right through our ancestry because we are always in danger in the dark. Try walking through the house when there's a power outage and see how many things you fall over. It's a basic primal fear. The darkness induces fear. We are always in, or at least we think we are. And we've been feeling that way since we have been living in caves. Since primitive man lived in a cave in the dark, terrified of what might be out there in the dark, the noises, the sounds. We created the myth that fire came from the gods because it saved us from the terrors of the dark. We talk about the coming of the light. We talk, you know, that even that notion of the yearly cycle and the midwinter festivals that celebrate the coming back of the light, this fear of darkness, this coming of the light. All of that is represented in so many different ways, in so many different facets throughout literature, throughout Gothic horror, the coming of the light to save us from the dark. The vampire operates in the dark. It is the daylight, it is the sun, it is light that saves us from the evil of Dracula or any of the other vampires. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus believed that fire was the origin of all things because from light comes everything that is good. And to make another allusion to that, without fire or light, Game of Thrones teaches us the night is dark and full of terrors. Without that truth, without that simple truth lodged somewhere in our imagination, horror as an entertainment form cannot work. We want to be frightened, and we are afraid of being frightened. It's that wonderful dichotomy of the emotions. I want to be scared, but don't scare me. Now, for instance, some of the examples of what I mean about dark and light and the use of these things. Let's take, and it is a horror story in many ways, the only full novel that Conan Doyle wrote on the topic of Sherlock Holmes. Most of them are short stories, all of them, but he wrote one full novel and it's called The Hound of the Baskervilles. It's fascinating in that he builds up throughout this a pure Gothic horror scenario of a ghost hound, of a hound that haunts generation after generation of Baskervilles, and that the ones who die, the heads of the household that die generation after generation, are found dead outside in the dark after the howling of the hound, this hound from hell. And even when it's seen, it is black and it has got, luminescence all around it, and it is a creature of the dark, a creature of the night. The howling of the hound, like the howling of the wolves in Dracula, freezes the blood, makes everything terrifying, everything around it terrifying. Now, I just simply cite that Conan Doyle reference as just one example of how literature, how art has played on that, feasted indeed on that use of the imagination. And just as Bram Stoker does it with Dracula, every time you mention wolves, you can hear the howling in the night. Conan Doyle does exactly the same thing with The Hound of the Baskervilles. It's feeding upon our desire to be scared. And on that principle, there is absolutely nothing new in art. In the modern world of theater and novels and movies, we're constantly drawing on the same primal fears that we felt, when I say we, as humanity, from the very dawn of our distant ancestors, from those people who were crouched in caves, afraid of those strange noises in the night, afraid of the sounds, afraid of the darkness itself. That same fear rests within all of us, and that's what we, in the arts, prey upon, to give you the fear that you desire, in the safety of knowing that it will eventually go away. It'll stop, because it is only a play, a book, a movie, or whatever. We love them. So art teaches us, in a way, that all the basic principles of human existence just keep repeating themselves. The same fears that happened to the man in the cave, or happened to the primitive hunter-gatherer, the primitive farmer, society as it's built its way up over 10,000 years, the same fears are still there. It doesn't change. There aren't new ones. They're the same ones, but we rediscover them and we reapply them from our imagination. I'll give you an example that isn't about horror, which is art uses the same storyline over and over and over and over. How many of you saw the original movie, The Karate Kid? Wonderful movie. Well, like that kind of thing. And in it, you have this wise old Japanese teacher who knows particular wisdom concerning karate and will teach that wisdom to a young man who will work hard, not believe in himself, eventually come to believe in himself, so much so that despite incredible injury, he is still able to use the skills that he has learnt from the wise teacher to win the karate match. That is Yoda teaching Luke Skywalker the ways of the Force. It is exactly the same storyline. It is exactly the same thematic. It is just a repetition that wisdom is passed from the old to the young, who, in spite of their initial doubts, come to terms with that wisdom and use it and pass it on. That's the way that literature works, the way art works, because that's the way life works. And all we are as artists are reflectors. We hold the mirror up to nature. We don't create something new. We show what is. So the same is true of fear. Same stories over and over again. Let's look at Frankenstein. Now, everybody knows Frankenstein is one of the truly great Gothic horrors. It is a magnificent story from a remarkable experience from a writer who never wrote another one, but experienced it in what one might describe as fun weekend. No, that's a bit of a reduction. With a group of friends, probably indulging in noxious substances, which they would smoke or drink or do various things with. Anyway, Mary Shelley came up with this notion of Frankenstein, which was not something new. It's something old, and I'll explain what I mean by that. It's not only something old as a theme, it's also something very modern as a theme. And the theme is very simple. The creature that Frankenstein creates frightens us, not just because of its appearance, which, by the way, in the book did not have bolts in the neck, but because of what it implies. The implications of Frankenstein's creature frighten us. Now, it's been used, that theme, in so many different manifestations. And I'm not going to, I hope I don't offend anybody with what I'm about to say, but this is a fact. If you take the modern one, Frankenstein is making a creature out of dead people. The Emperor Palpatine creates a creature out of the basically dead, destroyed, and ashes of Anakin Skywalker. Darth Vader is the Emperor's creature. Just like Frankenstein makes his from dead bodies, Emperor Palpatine makes his from the remains of Anakin Skywalker. Making people out of dead people. Interesting concept. Making people out of ashes. Go back to the book of Genesis. God created man from the dust of the earth. God created woman from a bit of the man. From the flesh of the man, he created woman. From one perspective, by the way, the book of Genesis and indeed the book of Exodus are horror stories on a grand scale. They are full of it. They are full of things that other literature, other art forms have utilized for years and years and years and years. We've got plagues. We've got pestilence, rivers turning to blood. The angel that is passing over us is the angel of death. Every theme that you will find in those first two books of the Bible have been used as some form of a horror story or a tale of terror or a moral tale of if you behave badly, this is the suffering that you will, even the fall from grace, the fall from Eden for Adam and Eve has been reutilized and reutilized so many times. The potential sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham has been used so many times in literature to frighten us, and we love that fear. We learn all these images from childhood, just as we learn our moral perceptions from fairy tales. I talked last week about you can compare Goldilocks to Halloween. You can compare Hansel and Gretel to so many other tales of horror. And most of the tales by Brothers Grimm are, in fact, horror stories. Don't read them to your children, they'll scare them. And the angel of death from Exodus brings us to another fear. And the angel of death is just a manifestation, or rather, what I'm about to say is a manifestation of that same angel of death, the Grim Reaper. Death frightens us like darkness. Death is one of our great fears. The grave frightens us. Stories of grave robbers. The famous story of the two real grave robbers of Edinburgh, Burke and Hare, who would take up bodies and deliver them to doctors so that they could do medical research on them. But that fear of the grave robber, the fear of the grave, premature burial, that's another great primitive fear that so many people still have. You would be amazed the number of people who in their dying wishes is that they have their veins open so that they are not put into a coffin alive. But that was a thing that happened. People were often buried alive because they were in a catatonic trance, because medical science had not fully defined what death was. Nobody quite knew what death was. That's where the origin, for instance, Saved by the Bell, it's nothing to do with boxing. It's to do with the fact that people would go into into a coffin, there'd be a string attached, and at the top of the string outside the grave, there'd be a bell. If they woke up in the coffin, they could pull it. Somebody would be sitting there for a night or two to listen. Hence, the graveyard watch, which is now used by journalists sometimes. That notion, that fear of the grave, that fear of death is huge, and we delight in it. It excites us in the same way that watching an accident excites us. So as I say, building a new person from the remains of the dead is a very frightening notion, because it implies to us that our own death, our own remains, can become the material for mad scientists. And the mad scientist has another great, wonderful mythological fear, the necromancer, the person who brings back the dead or talks to the dead. It's been there throughout literature for 1,000 years and longer. That notion that we can be reused. Our inherent fear, the one many of us have, of vivisection, of genetic manipulation, even of stem cell research. All of those fears come from that same basic root fear that death frightens us. Our fear of death is not, very often, our fear of death is not simply the fear of dying, because that's something that we know deep down. We all know we're going to die. It can be sooner, it can be later, but there is one absolute certainty: we're going to die. Our fear is not of dying, but of being dead and knowing it. That's the real fear. It's utterly irrational, an irrational fear, being dead and knowing it. Now, if you are of a religious turn of mind, then you will go to your just reward, be it that way or that way. But you won't be just lying there. If you are not of a religious frame of mind, then you will know that when you are dead, you are dead. That's it. You return to the dust from which you came. But the illogical fear is that you are dead and know it. And again, literature, theatre, cinema has played upon that one for so long. The fear of living your death. Now back to that definition of fear from the Oxford English Dictionary. The likelihood of something unwelcoming happening. Something unwelcome happening. Waking up dead. And then you become a victim. You are the victim of death itself. You are a victim of the Grim Reaper. We are far more afraid, deep down, with the consequences of death than we are of actually dying. And literature proves it, and I'm going to give you the quote from Shakespeare, because he understood it wonderfully well, and it comes from Hamlet in the most famous speech ever written. What is death? The undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. We don't want to die because we don't know what it's going to be like when we wake up dead. It's a deep-rooted fear. We cash in on that one. Theatre cashes in on it. Cinema cashes in on it all the time. Look at all those films about people being brought back from the dead and turned into something, to some new dangerous form of criminal killer or whatever. It's I know this, I haven't seen it, but there's one series on, I think, called Altered Carbon. I haven't seen it, and I'm not particularly inclined to, but it is that notion that when you are dead, mad science can do strange things to you. We are terrified by that and excited at the prospect. By the way, this thing about fearing death, it's very interesting, just as a side note. Shakespeare's villains tend to be the ones who aren't afraid of death. Most of his heroes are sort of nervous of it, don't want it to happen, talk about it, are willing to face it, but would rather it didn't happen. But it's his villains who don't really seem to give a damn. And the greatest villain that he wrote is actually, it's not Iago, it's Aaron the Moor in Titus Andronicus. And what he said, I mean, he's sentenced to an utterly horrific death of being buried up to his neck and left to starve. His response to that threat and to death, he outfaces it because he is being punished for his sins. I am no baby. I that with base prayers I should repent the evils I have done. 10,000 worse than ever yet I did would I perform if I might have my will. If one good deed in all my life I did, I do repent it from my very soul. Now that's facing death with a tremendous degree of bravura. I don't care what you do to me. I regret nothing. That turns him into an almost Gothic monster. But he might be a true representative, and he's moving on to my next point and checking the time because I'm, as usual, talking too much. He is a perfect example of what we are now fascinated, a particular phrase that we owe to Star Wars. It's become part of the culture now, the dark side, the personification of evil. That also fascinates us. So what is this fascination with the dark side? Is it inherent in our own nature? Or is it a part of us that we repress but secretly delight in? Do we find a private joy in watching others through the medium of literature and theatre and cinema doing the things we dream of doing? Are our own nightmares simply ourselves furtively living out our dark desires? And Robert Louis Stevenson thought that might be the case. And I come to another great Gothic horror. Strangely enough, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll, and indeed Mr. Hyde. Stevenson put forward a very interesting and deeply tempting and disturbing proposition, one that most, if not all of us, have perhaps secretly considered, the dark side within us all. He writes in the voice of Dr. Jekyll, I understood that if I could rightly be said to be good or evil, it was only because I was radically and completely both. And what Stevenson is saying is that we are all intrinsically good and we are all intrinsically evil. It is simply which side of us that we project that the world understands us as. Jekyll then takes the transforming drug, which for the Victorian readers was a very risky business. Don't forget, science and medical science and all of those things were still evolving at a ferocious rate. I mean, even Louis Pasteur's notion that you wash your hands before you cut into somebody was considered very foolish and extremely insulting by many a Victorian surgeon. They didn't understand the principles of infection. So again, I come back to our fear of science and its strange powers. The notion of Jekyll taking a drug that goes fizzy and smokes and then drinking it off, that was terrifying and exciting. So he takes his drug and he describes it. There was something strange in my sensation, something indescribably new. I felt younger, lighter, happier. Don't we all want that for ourselves? Of course we do. Disordered sensual images running like a mill race in my mind. Dirty thoughts. Jekyll's mind had changed, and yet I was myself. I felt an unknown but familiar freedom of the soul. And there's the key word, a freedom of the soul. Freedom of the soul, guilt-free. There is a delight in the discovery of the darker self. It frightens us, but it excites us just as much. He comes later on to a very interesting series of confessions. I had come to the fatal crossroad. Perhaps if I'd approached my discovery in a more noble spirit, perhaps it might have been otherwise. And from those agonies of death and birth, there it is again, death and birth, I might have come forth an angel instead of a fiend. The drug had not chosen the result. I had. There's that great moment of confession, that all the evil that is within us can be brought out, that we could, if we take the wrong course, if we take the wrong drug, if we take the wrong thing, bring out the badness within us. Modern drug technology has proven to some extent this to be true. We are the masters and mistresses of our own downfall, is what he's saying. He continues, my badness was not simply waiting in the shadows. Sorry, read that again. My badness was simply waiting in the shadows, and when the moment came, I fell, like Lucifer, into the ultimate irresistible temptation. By the way, the reference to Lucifer is always interesting because when we sin, when we do bad things, we always need to lay off the blame. It is the classic case of the devil made me do it. Anyway, he goes on. I only had to drink the draught, and the outward morality of Henry Jekyll was transformed. Transformed. Edward Hyde alone in the ranks of mankind was purity itself. There was no corrupting influence of goodness or morality in him. Edward Hyde was pure and absolute evil. Again, Stevenson recognizing what we do, what our human nature is to do, laying off the blame by the idea of separate identity or of being possessed. Now, interesting, Stevenson allows us to continue this delusion that the dark side is a form of intrusion into ourselves, something exterior that's taken us over, the deep-rooted fear that we have of possession by demons. And we will often use that. I felt some demon made me do it, or something I couldn't explain. It was like something came into me and made me do it. The devil made me do it. But the great achievement of this particular tale of horror is that possession is not the outcome. There is no possession. And that is why this book is a piece of genius in that sense. Jekyll finally admits, I know now that he, Hyde, and I are not two, but one. The drug did not release Hyde. It simply suppressed Jekyll. Hyde, in all his awfulness, in all his passions, all his evil, is just me. The buried evil that is me. His sin is my sin. And in that sense, this becomes true horror. And it excites us because if we read it honestly and if we read it uncritically, if we read the book selflessly, we recognize in it that all of us are a Jekyll with a Hyde somewhere deep inside us waiting to get out. And that's the whole point of the book. That's the whole point of the concept, and it's been there throughout literature, that the badness in us is only waiting. And I think I used the phrase last week, and I certainly used it when we were talking about Macbeth a few months back. It is easy to summon demons. They are waiting for your call, and the demons are inside waiting. That's the genius of that particular aspect of the thing we fear most, and the thing that we fear most, if we're absolutely honest about it, is ourself. The most dreadful excitement that one can get from that is the realization that we may be as evil as we are good, but that the confession of this is in itself a sinful pleasure. Oscar Wilde said it when he was talking about his trial. I saw at once that what is said of a man is nothing. The point is who says it. A man's very highest moment is, I believe, no doubt at all, when he kneels in the dust and beats his breast and tells all the sins of his life. There is a kind of vicarious pleasure in admitting your fears, your desires, your dark side, of exposing it to the world, the kind of ultimate mea culpa. It is all my fault because I am fundamentally evil. There's a kind of pride in that. And of course, pride is one of the 7 deadly sins, so be careful what you confess. Now, the notion of possession is another one I want to come to as time is galloping on. The notion of possession is found in pretty much all forms of horror, even the blessed J.R.R. Tolkien. And what do I mean by that? Well, you could argue that The Lord of the Rings is also a horror story. Yes, it's an adventure tale. Yes, it's a tale of heroism. Yes, it's a tale of a magical world that, in a strange way, mirrors the world that we live in ourselves, of the great mythical horror that mirrored the horror of the First World War that he lived through. But it's also a horror story in its own right, and there is an instrument of horror, the power of the ring. It's a genius work in that it creates such a simple source of absolute power and absolute horror and evil. The ring is the same as Jekyll's drug, because anyone in possession of the ring, as Jekyll takes the drug and it brings the evil out of him, the ring releases the dark side of all the ring bearers. Bilbo and Frodo, who are ring bearers, will fall to the same fate as Smeagol. They will become golems in their own right if the power of the ring stays within them. In other words, the evil of the ring is that it brings out the evil desires within the ring bearer. It is exactly the same in that sense as the drug that Jekyll swallows. So the possession of the ring makes you possessed. And we all have a deep fear of this idea of satanic possession. Probably one of the most successful horror stories of all time, and indeed certainly one of the most successful horror movies of all time, is The Exorcist. Now, there are many, many reported tales of demonic possession, and indeed Catholic priests, I think, are still trained in the ritual of exorcism, although thankfully most of them are trained in psychology and psychotherapy as well. But exorcism is one of the rituals that the church offers. And the fear of demonic possession is, again, something when our rational minds say, no, this is not possible, but our irrational imaginations sort of want it to be because it excites us. And entertainment such as The Exorcist work on that principle. It plays on our fundamental fears that just such things as possession, as demonic possession, just might be possible. That there are demons out there waiting to possess us, or within us waiting to get out. And it is easy to summon demons. They are waiting for your call. Basically, we want to be afraid. And upon that particular desire, writers, theatre artists, we build a whole world of dread. We build a dread on your excitement at fear. Fears that your ancestors have experienced for, as I say, for 10,000 years and longer. Fear of the dark, fear of the unknown, fear of the unexpected, fear of God. Whether your God is up there or down there, fear of that. Fear excites us. Fear generates within us enormous degrees of the blood pumping through the veins, the adrenaline. Fear shows that you are alive. I'll give you one other example in terms of a horror movie. Again, one of the great horror movies ever made, and it's not about something that is mysterious or mythical. The movie is called Jaws, as was the book. But it is a horror story, in that great sense of the unknown. And John Williams, in his theme music for it, brilliant piece of composing, because it is that unknown, unexpected sound that makes us go, what's going on? The horror, Jaws is based not on anything mythical, but the horrors of the deep, the dark. The sea is deep and dark and full of terrors. How many of you, for instance, have been swimming in the ocean and have a fear, an irrational fear of swimming across a bed of seaweed. You know, where you see this, the water is clear, you see the sand, and there's this dark shadow, and it's just seaweed, that's all it is, but you're afraid of swimming across it. There's a primal fear of something reaching up, reaching out, and pulling you down. I think that's where the fear of mermaids came from. That fear of the unknown, that fear of the unexpected. It excites us and it terrifies us. Without that fear, there is nothing for us to play on your imagination. And it's in the imagination that fear exists. Because without the imagination, you cannot create those circumstances that foster fear. If it is dark and you cannot imagine things in the dark, if there are strange noises but your imagination cannot play upon them, you will experience no fear. So it is in the imagination always that fear exists, and it is upon the imagination that fear mongers, like novelists and like theatre practitioners and movie makers, it is upon the imagination and upon those fears that we play. The fact that there is nothing there in the dark that wasn't there when the light was on doesn't work with us. As far as we, the creators of horror, if you like, are concerned, we will convince you that there is something there in the dark that wasn't there when the light is on. When the lights go down in the theatre, we will either thrill you or delight you or make you afraid. That's our function. And it's up to your imagination to make that work. And you may think you won't be afraid in the dark, but deep down, when the wolves howl and the floors creak and the cold breath touches your neck, you will be afraid. You will be. Because that is what you desire. On that, I end my sermon on the principles of Gothic horror. So, have we got any questions coming in out of that? Yes, somebody's got a point there. Pen, is the turn of the screw horror or is it something else? The turn of the screw, I'm glad you brought that one up. Henry James, that is horror. That is in its pure sense horror, but it is an exact example of what I'm talking about. Are there ghosts or is it totally the imagination of the governess? Henry James doesn't tell you. He simply allows you to experience the horror that she is experiencing. He allows you to see the ghosts only through her eyes. It is for you to decide. Is it true? Is it not? But I think in most people who read that book, and the original movie of it, by the way, was the best version of it, it is within that we delight. Because the majority of people, I think, sort of want there to be ghosts, even though they may suspect it's purely her imagination. But on the twin level, if there are ghosts, it satisfies our imagination. If there are no ghosts, it demonstrates that her imagination is what sees them, which proves my point, that all fear is in the mind, is in the imagination. So yeah, I would describe it very much as a horror story. And yes, Ben, I agree with you. The not knowing makes it more horrifying than actually knowing. And all horror should work on that level. That when it's almost like when you close the book or leave the theater or the movie house, you're asking yourself, but what if? And that same question that makes us dread not dying but being dead. What if I wake up and I'm dead? And What will happen? What happens if I am dead, but they chop me up and start making bits of other people? What, all of those questions that lie deep in the imagination, that rooted fear that is quite absolutely ancestral. It's fascinating. We do use, sometimes, yes, we use drugs. I think some people will use drugs. And all the research that was done into, for instance, LSD and other the psychedelics, the other, mind-altering drugs that have been produced, the research was to discover what is released within us, within our imagination, when we use drug stimuli. Some people think that's horror. Some people think it's fascinating scientific research. But as we all know, fascinating scientific researchers have been horrifying us through literature and art for years and years and years, and long may they continue to do so. What would I say? Grace has the quote. What would I say is the strongest sense with regard to horror and fear, or is there a combination? I think it's a good question, and I think, as a practitioner, whose job it is to delight you and to frighten you sometimes, I think it is a combination of sight and sound. I think they are the two things. I mean, you can have immersive experiences where touch comes into play. If you are blindfolded and things put into your hand that can terrify you, smells can terrify you as well. But in general, any of the five senses can cause fear, any of them. You can smell something. This is the classic case. You're in the dark cellar alone. There is no light on, and suddenly you smell gas. You're frightened. So any of the senses can cause terror. But in terms of the entertainment industry, and I include literature in that, it is generally what we see or what we can't see, what we hear or what we think we hear, that actually elicits the most in terms of fear and then consequently terror. Thank you, David, for enjoying Dr. Jekyll. Yes, indeed, Shelley's The Last Man is post-apocalyptic. Does have. I recommend reading anything written by any horror writer. If you find, you can go through Lovecraft, you can go through H.G. Wells. Any. Bram Stoker didn't just write Dracula; he wrote several tales of horror, all worth a good read. Scuba diving, is a unique and very terrifying experience. I haven't done it much. I've done a bit of it in my youth. Wouldn't go near it now. But when you dive into the abyss, it is quite fascinating and can be quite terrifying because you hear things in a different way as well. Sounds sound different underwater. Even the sound of air coming out of the aqualung is slightly because you know that is life. And without that, you are no longer alive. You drown. Drowning is apparently, they say, one of the easiest ways to die. How do they know? They haven't drowned. But that notion of the silence and the light going slowly in the act of drowning must be a totally terrifying experience. I wouldn't fancy it. I didn't see Benedict Cumberbatch's Frankenstein, no, Kendra, but I did quite like what they did, the movie with what's his name and thingy. The names have gone straight out of my head. There have been some very good movie versions of it and some very good staged versions of it. I didn't see that one. I believe it was very interesting. Yes. Don't choke, Dennis. Don't choke. What I like about the more modern interpretations of many of these stories is that they are facing the realities. They're not trying to create horror simply by, the classic, the original Frankenstein movie with the bolts in the neck and things, quite unnecessary because Karloff's interpretation of the creature was really very moving. It was really quite beautiful and innocent. Lost. The whole bolts in the neck and funny head thing was totally unnecessary. But of course, back then they thought if you're going to be horrible, you've got to look horrible as well. I don't know if anybody has watched the series that had all the various characters in it, and it's on Netflix, I think. And again, I'm useless. I can never remember names of anything. But there is a wonderful Frankenstein's creature in that is deeply human. Frankenstein's creature is not simply made of humans, but deeply human. And we must remember that. It has all the frailties and the innocence of humanity. And that's another thing that makes it one of the most horrifying things in the world is innocence. Because innocence lacks wisdom. And with the lack of wisdom comes danger and the unexpected. Horror has an awful lot of possibilities about it. Penny Dreadful, that is exactly. Thank you very much, Ken. Penny Dreadful was the series, and if you haven't seen it, I recommend it. It was certainly the first two. So the third series is a bit odd, but the first two are very, very good indeed. And the Frankenstein's monster in that is a beautiful. I shouldn't say monster. Frankenstein's creature in that was beautifully observed and a remarkably clever portrayal of innocence and honesty. And honesty sometimes, innocence very often leads to violence, which is even more horrifying. The Haunting, a very good piece of horror. Wonderful use of the imagination to feed your own particular fears. I could go on forever, and everybody else seems to be enjoying this. Yes, that's a very good point, Dennis, and I do like that one, and I agree with it. That ignorance is thinking Frankenstein is the monster or the creature. It's not. The monster is Frankenstein himself. The creature is the product of Frankenstein's monstrous belief that he could create life, that he was doing something good, which in fact was completely wrong. Anyway, there are morals to every one of these tales. That is enough for now. I have to draw to a close. A quick thank you. We I have a note somewhere of our sponsor for this week, same as last week, and thank you so much. We really appreciate all sponsorship. This one is done in memoriam, which I think is a lovely way of helping us. If you are interested in sponsoring any of these webinars, and we are here every week except Christmas and New Year, do drop us a note on an email or a text or whatever, saying that you would like to sponsor. We'll send you all the details. We are deeply grateful for that. We are also deeply grateful for any donation you can send us. Times are getting hard and indeed harder, and we want to be able to keep presenting our work, not just these webinars, but the dramas that we can present. And to that extent, let me remind you yet again, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll is still available online until Halloween. Go to our website, click on the big banner that says The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll, and that'll take you straight through to it. There's a small fee for listening to it. You can listen to it for 72 hours. It only takes an hour and 57 minutes, which means you can listen to it quite a few times while it's still available to you. But please consider doing that. Please consider sending us a donation. On the same website, you'll see a little donation button. Just click that. Every single dollar, pound, euro, yen, zloty, whatever you have, every one of them helps and helps us to keep the work going. We've got lots of nice things coming up for you. In the month of November, we're going to have 2 programs. We're going to do another Shakespeare, and this time a comedy. We're going to have 2 programs on the topic of Twelfth Night, which is possibly his most famous comedy and very dark in many ways. So please join us for that. We're also going to have a program or a webinar on the topic of Noel Coward, one of the greatest English comedy writers for the theatre. And we're going to have a special surprise as well. More about that coming up. We will have, we hope, another radio drama coming up just prior to Christmas, if everything goes well. We are always dependent upon the effects of the COVID-19 restrictions. But we brought you Dr. Jekyll. We hope to bring you another one over the Christmas vacation. Everything is ready for it. We're all prepared and ready to go. We just have to get clearance that we're allowed to bring the actors together and present this. So more about that will be coming up, and you'll all be getting emails about that when it happens. And that is about all we have for the moment, except to say, look after yourselves, tell your friends about us, wear your mask, wash your hands, and vote. Thank you all for being with us. See you next week.